Welcome to this channel. Before you watch this video, it's a good idea to press the subscribe, like, and share buttons with your friends so that this channel continues to grow. Thank you. I never thought I would be the kind of person who writes something like this. I am not a superstitious person. I grew up camping. I love the woods, and I have spent more nights sleeping in a tent than in my own bed some summers. But what happened to me and my friends at that camp in the Appalachians 3 years ago changed something inside me. I still have trouble sleeping if the room gets too quiet. It was late August. Me and 4 friends, Tyler, Jesse, Marcus, and Dana, drove up to an old summer camp in West Virginia that had been shut down since the early 90s, one of those places you can rent out privately now, on us cabins and a main lodge and a little lake. It looked rough around the edges, but that was part of the appeal. We wanted something off the grid. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, just trees and fire and cold beer. The drive up was already a little unsettling, if I am being honest. The road into the property was unpaved and narrow, and the tree line on both sides was so thick that even at midday, it felt like dusk. There was a rusted sign at the entrance that said, Camp Hollow Ridge. Someone had painted over part of it a long time ago, and you could barely read the name underneath the flaking gray paint. We got there around 4 in the afternoon. The main lodge smelled like old wood and something damp underneath it, like a wet basement. The person who rented us the place, a quiet older man who met us at the gate, walked us through everything fast, like too fast looking back. He pointed out the cabins, told us the generator was around back, said the lake was fine to swim in, and then he just left. Did not stay to chat, did not wave goodbye. He got in his truck and drove out, and that was the last we saw of him. The first night was fine. We made a fire, we told dumb stories. Dana burned the hot dogs, and we all complained about it. Marcus found an old camp schedule tacked to the wall inside the lodge, dated 1991, with activities like archery and nature walks and a swimming relay. It felt like a time capsule. Jesse thought it was cool. I thought it was a little sad, all those kids who came here once, and then the place just froze in time. I woke up around 2 in the morning that first night because I heard something outside my cabin. Not a dramatic sound, not anything I could easily describe. It was more like the feeling you get when someone is standing too close to you in a quiet room. I lay in my sleeping bag and I listened. The woods were making noise the way woods always do, wind and branches and whatever animals move around at night. But underneath all of that, I had this slow creeping feeling that something was very close to my cabin wall. Just standing there, not moving, just being there. I told myself it was a deer. I went back to sleep. The next day, nobody said anything weird had happened. We went swimming. We explored the old archery range. We found one of the smaller cabins set back in the trees that was not on the map the rental guy gave us. The door was padlocked. The windows were covered from the inside with what looked like old towels. Marcus wanted to break in, and I said no. I do not know why I said no so fast. I just had a feeling. That second night is when things started to shift. We were all sitting around the fire after dinner when Dana said she had seen someone standing at the edge of the tree line earlier that afternoon. She said it like it was not a big deal, kind of laughing about it, saying it was probably just a hiker or a local cutting through the property. But the way she described it made me put my drink down. She said the person was just standing there between 2 trees, not moving, not doing anything, just watching us at the lake. And when she looked away and looked back, they were gone. Nobody said anything for a second. Then Tyler said he had noticed something too, but had not wanted to bring it up. He said that when he went to check the generator in the afternoon, he found a line of small rocks arranged in a perfect straight line on the ground, leading from the tree line toward the back of the lodge. He thought maybe we had done it without him noticing. None of us had. We all kind of laughed it off. Probably kids from somewhere nearby messing around. Old camp, creepy location, easy target for local teenagers to come and spook the renters. That was what we told ourselves, and it worked well enough to get us through the night. But I did not sleep much. I lay in that cabin, and I stared at the ceiling, and I listened. At some point, maybe around 3 in the morning, I heard footsteps on the dirt path outside. Slow and even. Not running, not stumbling, just walking. The sound went past my door and continued around the side of the cabin, and then stopped somewhere near the back wall. I counted to 60 in my head. I counted again. Nothing else happened. No more sound. I did not get up. I want to be clear about that because I think about it a lot now. I did not get up and open that door. Something in me, some basic animal part of my brain, said absolutely do not open that door. So I just lay there and waited for morning. When the sun came up, I went outside and I looked at the dirt around the back of my cabin. There were footprints, not animal prints, boot prints. Someone had walked up to the back wall of my cabin and stood there. The prints faced the wall. They did not turn around. They just stopped there, facing the cabin, like whoever made them had stood at that wall and stared at it from the outside. I took a photo. I still have it on my phone. I showed the others at breakfast, and the mood changed completely. Marcus said we should just leave. Jessie agreed. Dana was quiet, which was not like her at all. Tyler was the one who said maybe we should stay one more night and see what happened. And I think we all agreed partly because leaving in daylight felt like the safer option, and none of us wanted to be on that narrow, dark road after sunset. That was a mistake. The third night, I did not even pretend to try to sleep. I sat up in my sleeping bag with a flashlight in my hand, and I watched the gap under my cabin door. The gap was maybe 2 inches of dark space between the bottom of the door and the floor. You could see the faint grayish light from outside coming through it. Around midnight, the light coming through that gap changed. Something blocked it. Something was standing right outside my door, not moving, not making a sound, just standing there on the other side of that door, close enough that their feet were blocking the outside light from coming underneath it. I did not breathe. I do not think I blinked. I sat there and I watched that gap and I counted and I prayed and I did not make a single sound. After what felt like 10 minutes, but was probably 2, the light came back under the door. Whatever was there had moved away. I have never told anyone what I did next. I crawled to the far corner of the cabin, the one farthest from the door, and I pulled my sleeping bag over my head like a child, and I stayed there until I could hear birds. When morning came, I did not feel relieved. That is the thing about that kind of fear. It does not just go away when the sun comes up. It sits in your chest like a stone, and it stays there. I came out of my cabin, and Tyler was already outside sitting on the steps of the lodge with his hands wrapped around a coffee mug, and he looked like he had not slept either. We looked at each other and did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "We need to leave today." I said yes before he even finished the sentence. We got the others up, and we started packing. Nobody argued. Nobody suggested staying. Even Marcus, who had been the most skeptical about all of it, was throwing his stuff into his bag without a word. Dana was moving fast and quiet and kept looking toward the tree line every few seconds like she was checking something. It was Jessie who found it. She had gone to do one last check of the main lodge to make sure we had not left anything inside, and she came back out onto the porch and just stood there. She did not call out to us. She just stood there until we noticed her face and walked over. On the long wooden table inside the lodge, the one we had been eating at for 3 days, someone had laid out a collection of things. There was a child's shoe, old and rotted, the kind of shoe that would have been worn in the 80s or 90s. There was a small bundle of what looked like hair tied with a piece of twine. There was a folded piece of paper, and there were 4 small stones arranged in a square around all of it. None of us had put those things there. We had eaten breakfast at that table 2 hours earlier, and there had been nothing on it. Tyler unfolded the paper, and we all leaned in. It was a page torn from what looked like a camp logbook. At the top it had a date, July 14th, 1991. Below the date was a list of names. 12 names, all first names, all written in neat, careful handwriting. At the bottom of the page, below all the names, someone had written something in different handwriting, darker and less careful, like it had been added later. It said, "They did not leave either." We left. We did not clean up the fire pit. We did not return the key to the lockbox by the gate. We got in the car and we drove down that narrow road, and none of us spoke until we hit the main highway and could see other cars and gas stations and normal life again. On the drive home, I looked up Camp Hollow Ridge on my phone once I had signal again. There was almost nothing. A few old posts on a local West Virginia history forum. One of them mentioned that the camp had closed suddenly in the summer of 1991 after an incident that the post described only as a tragedy involving several campers. There were no details. The thread had been started by someone asking if anyone knew what had happened, and nobody had given a clear answer. I tried to find the rental listing when I got home. The website was gone. The email address we had booked through bounced back. The phone number was disconnected. I still think about those 12 names on that list. I never looked them up. Part of me is afraid of what I might find, and part of me is more afraid that I would find nothing at all. I'm like those kids had just been erased from everything except that one torn page left on a table in the middle of the woods for someone to find. I do not go camping anymore. My friends do not bring it up. We have an unspoken agreement that we do not talk about that trip. But sometimes, when I am in a quiet room late at night and the house settles and makes a sound, I think about that gap under my cabin door. And I think about the light going dark. And I think about whoever was standing on the other side. I was 19 when I took a job as a camp counselor in the mountains of West Virginia. It was one of those old summer camps that had been running since the 1960s, nestled deep in the Appalachian woods where the trees grew so thick that sunlight barely touched the ground, even at noon. And the pay was garbage, but I needed money for college, and honestly, I thought it would be fun. Fresh air, kids, campfires, easy summer. The camp was called Cedar Hollow. Cute name, wrong place. The first week was totally normal. I had a cabin of 8 boys, ages 10 to 12, and they were the usual mix of homesick kids and little troublemakers. We did hikes, we did swimming, we did the rope course. Every night we sat around the fire and told dumb jokes. I started to really like it out there. But around the end of the first week, one of my kids, a quiet boy named Marcus, started acting different. He stopped eating with the group. He would sit at the edge of the woods during free time and just stare into the trees. I figured he was homesick, so I went over and sat with him one afternoon and asked him if he was okay. He looked at me and said, very calmly, "There is a woman in the trees, and she watches us every night." I laughed a little. Kids say stuff like that all the time. I told him it was probably a deer and that he should come eat dinner. But that night, after lights out, I sat outside on the cabin steps like I usually did, drinking bagged coffee from a thermos. The woods were dark and the only sound was crickets and the distant sound of the river. I was not scared at all. I was just tired. Then I noticed that the crickets stopped. Not slowly. All at once, just silence. I had been in the woods enough to know that when the crickets go quiet, something is moving nearby. I stood up and looked toward the tree line, maybe 30 feet from the cabin. There was enough moonlight to see the shapes of the trunks and the dark space between them. And I saw something standing there. It was tall and thin, and it was not moving. It was just standing between two trees at the edge of the clearing, facing our cabin. I could not make out a face. I could not tell if it was a person or just a weird shadow from the branches. I stood there frozen for what felt like a very long time, staring at it, waiting for it to move. It never moved. Eventually, the crickets started up again, and I convinced myself it was just a shadow. I went inside and told myself to go to sleep. The next morning, I mentioned it to the other counselors at breakfast, and they laughed it off. One of them, a guy named Derek, who had worked there 3 summers in a row, went quiet for a second and then said, "Yeah, don't stare at the tree line at night. Just a rule I have." I asked him why, and he just shrugged and changed the subject. I did not push it, but I kept thinking about the way his face changed for just that 1 second. That is the part that really got me. Not the shape in the trees, not Marcus and his weird, calm voice. It was Derek's face, and the way he clearly knew something and chose not to say it. Because that is how you know something is actually wrong. Page 2. Something wrong with the trail. The second week started, and I tried to keep things normal. I focused on the kids, ran the activities, smiled through the campfire songs. But I started noticing small things that I could not explain away as easily as I wanted to. The first thing was the trail. Cedar Hollow had about 4 hiking trails mapped out through the woods. They were color-coded with little painted marks on the trees, the kind you see at every summer camp in America. Red, blue, yellow, and green. Simple stuff, for I had walked all 4 of them during staff orientation, and none of them were longer than 2 miles round trip. But on Tuesday of the second week, I took my group out on the yellow trail, which was supposed to loop back to camp in about 45 minutes. We walked, and we walked. And after an hour, we had not seen the camp clearing yet. I was not panicking because the trail markers were still there on the trees, so I knew we were on the right path. I just kept moving. After an hour and 20 minutes, I started to feel something uncomfortable in my chest. Not quite fear, but something close to it. The feeling you get when something is slightly off, and your brain knows it before you do. The boys were starting to get tired, and a couple of them were complaining, and I was running out of cheerful things to say to keep them moving. Then Marcus, who was walking near the back of the group, said quietly, "We already passed that rock." I stopped and looked back at him. He was pointing at a large flat boulder sitting just off the left side of the trail. It was mossy and had a weird crack running through the middle of it. I did not remember passing it before. I said, "Are you sure?" He nodded and said, 3 times. I felt cold all over. I looked at the boulder, and I looked at the trail ahead, and I made a decision to turn around completely and walk back the way we came instead of following the loop. 20 minutes later, we walked out into the camp clearing, totally fine. The other counselors were setting up for lunch, and nobody had even noticed we were late. I did not tell anyone about what Marcus said. I wrote it off as a kid being dramatic. And that night, Derek found me after dinner and asked how the Yellow Trail hike went. I told him it took longer than I expected. He looked at me for a moment and said, "Did you finish the loop or turn back?" I told him I turned back. He nodded slowly like that was the right answer and said, "Good. Do not finish the Yellow Trail loop. I know it sounds stupid, but just trust me on that one." I asked him what happens if you finish it. He looked down at his coffee cup and said, "The last counselor who did came back alone. Said he lost the kids. We found all the kids back at camp, totally fine. He was the one who was actually lost for 6 hours. Would not talk about what he saw out there." He said it so casually, like it was just a camp fact, like knowing which shower had bad water pressure. Then he walked away. I sat with that story for the rest of the evening. I kept thinking about those 40 extra minutes on the trail, and the rock we passed 3 times, and the way the woods had been so completely silent the whole time we were out there. I had not noticed the silence until just then, sitting there remembering it. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just our footsteps and the sound of my own breathing for almost an hour and a half. That night I sat on the cabin steps again with my coffee. I made myself not look at the tree line. I stared at the ground the whole time. But right before I went inside, I heard something that made me sit completely still for a long time. It was a humming sound, low and slow, coming from somewhere in the trees. It sounded almost like a person humming a song to themselves, the way you would hum while washing dishes or folding laundry. Completely ordinary, except for the fact that it was coming from the woods at midnight in the mountains of West Virginia, and there was nobody out there. It went on for maybe 2 minutes, and then it stopped. I went inside and locked the cabin door, which I had never done before. Marcus was the only kid still awake. He was lying in his bunk looking at the ceiling. He did not say anything, and neither did I. But right before I turned off my flashlight, he said in a very small voice, "She hums like that when she is getting closer." I did not sleep at all that night. Page 3, her face in the water. By the 3rd week, I had made a private decision that I was going to finish out the summer and never come back to Cedar Hollow again. I told myself I just needed to get through the remaining weeks, collect my paycheck, and go home. I stopped asking Derek questions because I realized that his answers made everything worse and not better. I just kept my head down and did my job. But the camp had other plans. On Wednesday, we took the kids down to the swimming area, which was a wide, calm section of the river, about a 10-minute walk from the main cabins. It was a beautiful spot, honestly. The water was clear and cold, and the rocks along the bank were smooth and flat, perfect for sitting. On a normal day, it was my favorite part of the camp routine. We got the kids in the water, and I was standing on the bank watching them splash around when one of my boys, a loud and funny kid named Tyler, who was afraid of absolutely nothing, it suddenly stopped swimming and stood up in the middle of the river. The water was only chest deep where he was standing. He was completely still, looking down into the water. I called out to him and asked if he was okay. He did not answer for a moment. Then he walked back to the bank slowly and sat down on a rock next to me. His face was strange. Not scared exactly, more like the face someone makes when they are trying to figure out if what they just saw was real. I asked him again what happened. He said, "There is a face in the water." I looked out at the river. The surface was clear and still where he had been standing. I could see the sandy bottom and a few dark rocks. Nothing else. I told him it was probably just his own reflection and that he should get back in and have fun. He shook his head slowly and said, "It was not my face." He did not get back in the water for the rest of the afternoon. He just sat on that rock and watched the other kids swim with this flat, quiet expression that did not belong on a 12-year-old boy. Tyler, who normally never stopped talking and laughing, did not say another word the entire walk back to camp. That evening, I went back to the swimming area alone after dinner. I do not know why. I think part of me needed to see it for myself, needed to look down into that water and see nothing, and be able to breathe normally again. The sun was getting low, and the light on the river was orange and gold, and honestly beautiful. I walked out into the water up to my knees. It was cold, and the current pushed gently against my legs. I stood in the spot where Tyler had been standing, and I looked down. For a second I saw nothing, just the sandy bottom and my own legs and a few small fish moving near the rocks. I almost laughed with relief. Then the water went completely still. No current, no ripple, nothing. Like someone had pressed pause on the whole river. And I saw a face looking up at me from under the surface. It was a woman. Long dark hair floating around her head, like she was lying on the bottom of the river. Her skin was very pale, the kind of pale that has nothing to do with sunlight. Her eyes were open, and she was looking directly at me. Not at the surface, not at the sky. Directly at my face, like she could see me perfectly clearly from down there. She did not look angry. She did not look scary in the way a monster looks scary in a movie. She looked patient. That was the worst part. She looked like someone who had been waiting for a very long time and was completely comfortable waiting much longer. I stepped backwards so fast that I fell down in the water and soaked myself completely. I scrambled up and walked back to the bank as fast as I could without letting myself run, because some part of my brain said that running would be the wrong thing to do. I did not look back at the water. I walked back to camp soaking wet, and when Derek saw me, he did not even ask what happened. He just looked at me and said, "You went back to the swimming hole alone, did you not?" It was not a question. I said yes. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "She has been in that river since before this camp existed, probably before anyone was keeping track. The locals know about her. That is why none of the people from town will swim there." I asked him who she was. He shook his head and said he did not know. Nobody did. He said the only thing anyone seemed to agree on was that she was connected somehow to the woods, to the trails, to the thing that stood at the tree line at night. Like they were all the same thing wearing different shapes. I stood there dripping river water onto the dirt, and I asked him why he kept coming back every summer if he knew all of this. He thought about it for a long time. Then he said, "Because nothing has actually happened. Not yet." Those two words sat in my stomach like a stone for the rest of the night. Not yet. As if he was certain that eventually something would, and he was simply waiting to find out what it was going to be. That night, the humming came again from the trees, and closer than before, much closer. And this time, when I made myself not look, I heard footsteps in the grass just beyond the edge of the clearing. Slow and steady, moving along the tree line from left to right, like something was walking a slow circle around the cabins. It made one full circle, and then it stopped. Then Marcus opened the cabin door and sat down next to me on the steps without saying anything. We sat there together in the dark for a long time. Two people who both knew something was wrong and had no idea what to do about it. After a while, he said very quietly, "She is deciding." I asked him what she was deciding. He pulled his knees up to his chest and said, "Whether it is time yet." Page 4. The last night at Cedar Hollow. By the final week, I had stopped sleeping properly. Not because of nightmares. I actually rarely dreamed at all anymore. but because every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face in the water looking up at me with that terrible patient expression. I was running on bad coffee and the kind of tired that lives in your bones. The kids could feel that something was off. Even the loud ones got quieter. Tyler had not fully come back to himself since the swimming hole. He laughed at things and played games, but there was a layer missing from him, like someone had turned his volume down just slightly and had not turned it back up. Marcus had always been quiet, so nobody noticed that he had stopped speaking almost entirely, except to me, and only at night on the cabin steps. On Thursday evening, 2 days before the end of camp, Derek came and found me at dinner and told me that one of the maintenance guys, an older local man named Carl, who had worked at Cedar Hollow for over 20 years, had not shown up for work that morning. Nobody had heard from him. The camp director was not worried yet because Carl had a history of taking unannounced days off. But Derek was worried, and the look on his face told me I should be worried too. I asked Derek if Carl had ever talked to him about the woman in the woods. Derek said, "Carl was the one who told me about her in the first place. First summer I worked here, he sat me down and said, 'There are 3 rules at this camp. Do not finish the Yellow Trail loop. Do not go to the swimming hole alone after 4 in the afternoon. And do not look at the tree line after dark.' I told him I had broken all 3 of those rules. Derek looked at me for a long moment and said, 'I know. I have been watching you all summer wondering when something was going to happen.' I asked him why he did not warn me earlier, back at the beginning of summer when I might have actually been able to use the information. He said, 'Because the ones who get warned early always go looking. The curiosity gets them. The ones who figure it out slowly are at least a little bit afraid by the time they understand what they are dealing with.' I wanted to be angry at him, but I was too tired and too scared, and honestly, he was probably right. That night was the clearest night we had all summer. The sky was full of stars, and there was a cool wind coming down from the higher elevation, and it would have been a genuinely beautiful night if I had not been sitting on those cabin steps, feeling like something was building toward an ending I could not see yet. The humming started earlier than usual. Still light outside, the last gray of sunset just fading from the sky. And already that low, slow sound was drifting out from between the trees. I kept my eyes on the ground between my feet. Then Marcus came and sat beside me. He had his camp blanket wrapped around his shoulders, and he looked exhausted in the way that kids only look when something has been scaring them for a long time, and they are too young to know how to process it. We sat in silence for a while. The humming got a little louder. The wind picked up. Then Marcus said, "When she showed me something last night." I asked him what he meant. He said that he had woken up in the middle of the night and looked out the cabin window, the small one above his bunk that faced the tree line, and she had been standing right at the edge of the clearing. Not between the trees this time. At the very edge, in the open, where the grass of the clearing met the dark of the woods. He said she was looking at the cabin window, and when he looked at her face, he realized it was the same face from the river. Same pale skin, same dark hair, same patient expression. He said she lifted one hand and pointed not at him, past him, at something inside the cabin. I felt every hair on my body stand up. I asked him what she was pointing at. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She was pointing at the empty bunk, the one nobody uses, the one in the corner." Every cabin had one extra bunk that stayed empty, just a camp policy for extra storage space. Our empty bunk was in the far corner near the door, and for the entire summer I had never once thought about it. I thought about it now. I went inside and turned my flashlight on and walked to the corner bunk. The mattress was bare and flat, and there was a small wooden shelf above it where kids could put their stuff. The shelf in our cabin had been empty all summer, except now there was something on it. A small bundle of sticks, maybe 8 inches long, tied together with a thin strip of dark cloth. The sticks were arranged in a rough shape, not like a bundle you might find in the woods, more deliberate than that, more like something that had been made by hand and placed there carefully. And I had cleaned this cabin myself at the start of camp. That shelf had been empty. I was certain of it. I picked it up and my hands were shaking. I brought it outside and showed it to Marcus, and his face went completely white. He said, "She wants you to know she has been inside." I stood there in the dark, holding that bundle of sticks, and I understood for the first time what Derek meant when he said nothing had happened yet. Because this was the not yet arriving. This was whatever she had been deciding all summer, finally becoming a decision. I walked straight to Derek's cabin and banged on his door and showed him what I had found. He looked at it for a long time without touching it, and then he said, very quietly, "Pack your important stuff tonight. Tell your kids to do the same. We are leaving at first light, before the director is even up." I asked what we were going to tell the camp director. He said, "Family emergency. All of us, same emergency. She will be annoyed, but she will not follow up immediately, and by the time she does, we will all be 3 hours down the mountain." I asked if we could just wait the last 2 days out. Derek looked at me and said, "2 nights ago, you broke all 3 rules and nothing happened. Last night she was standing in the open clearing. Tonight she was inside the cabin. Do you want to find out what tomorrow night looks like?" I did not. We left at 5:30 in the morning before the sun was fully up. 8 boys and 2 counselors piling into the camp van with our bags while the rest of the camp slept. I drove because Derek's hands were shaking too badly to hold the wheel. None of the kids asked why we were leaving early. Not one of them. They just got in the van and sat quietly, like they had all been waiting for someone to make this decision and were simply relieved that someone finally had. I watched Cedar Hollow disappear in the rearview mirror as we pulled down the long gravel drive. The woods were gray and still in the early morning light. Beautiful and silent. At the edge of the tree line, right where the gravel drive entered the camp clearing, a tall, thin shape was standing. Not moving, just watching us go. I pressed the gas and did not look back again. I never went back to Cedar Hollow. I looked it up online a few years later and found that the camp had quietly closed the following summer. No explanation given on their website, just a short notice saying they were not accepting registrations anymore. The website went offline after that. Carl, the maintenance guy who disappeared that Thursday, was never found. I still think about Marcus sometimes, about the way he sat beside me on those steps every night, like he understood something about that place that the rest of us were only beginning to figure out. I have always wondered how he knew the things he knew, and whether knowing them cost him anything in the long run. I do not hike in the Appalachian woods anymore. Not because I think she is everywhere, but because I learned something that summer that I cannot unlearn, which is that some places have been waiting in the dark for much longer than any of us have been alive, and they are very, very patient. And patience, more than anything else, is what you should actually be afraid of. I grew up in a small town in eastern Kentucky, the kind of place where everybody knows everybody, and the mountains sit so close to the main road that on cloudy days, the fog just swallows the whole street whole. I lived there until I was 22, and for most of my life, I thought I knew every corner of that town by heart. Every house, every family, every shortcut through every backyard. But there was one street I never fully understood. and it took me longer than I am comfortable admitting to realize that something about it was not right. The street was called Dunmore Road. It ran along the base of the mountain on the east side of town, maybe a quarter-mile long, with older houses on both sides and a dead end where the road just stopped at a wall of trees. Nothing special to look at. Just a quiet residential street with cracked pavement and overgrown grass between the sidewalk slabs. The kind of street you drive down without thinking about it. I drove down Dunmore Road almost every day because it was the fastest way to get from my house to the gas station where I worked the morning shift. It saved me about 4 minutes compared to taking the main road around. 4 minutes matters when you are perpetually running late, which I always was. For the first couple of years, I never thought anything of it. I just drove through, usually early in the morning while it was still dark in winter, and I never paid it much attention. But one morning in November, I was driving through around 6:15 and I realized something that stopped my brain mid-thought. I had never once seen a single person on that street, not walking a dog, not getting into a car, not standing on a porch. Not a single person, ever, in 2 years of driving through almost daily. I sat with that thought for the rest of my shift and convinced myself I was being ridiculous. People are just inside their houses in the early morning. That is normal. That is what people do. But once I noticed it, I could not stop noticing it. I started paying attention every time I drove through. Morning, afternoon, evening. Different days of the week, different weather. And it was always the same. The street was always completely empty. Cars parked in driveways, lights on inside houses sometimes. But never a single human being visible outside. I mentioned it to my coworker, Diane, who had lived in town her whole life, even longer than me. And I told her I had never seen anyone actually out on Dunmore Road and asked if she thought that was weird. She stopped what she was doing and looked at me and said, "I do not use Dunmore Road." I asked her why. She went back to what she was doing and said, "I just do not. There are other ways to get where you are going." That was all she would say about it. Same energy as Derek back at that camp, that specific kind of non-answer that is somehow worse than any actual answer could be. Page 2, the man on the porch. I want to be clear about something before I get into what happened next. I am not someone who scares easily. I grew up in the mountains. I hunted with my dad from the time I was 12. I have been in situations that would make most people nervous and walked out of them fine. I say this not to sound tough, but because I want you to understand that when I tell you the next part made me genuinely afraid, I mean it in a way I do not say lightly. It was a Saturday in late November, around 4 in the afternoon. The light in eastern Kentucky in late November gets thin and gray by mid-afternoon, the kind of light that makes everything look a little washed out and flat. I was driving home from the gas station after a double shift, and I was tired and not really thinking, and I turned onto Dunmore Road out of pure habit. I was about halfway down the street when I saw him. There was a man sitting on the porch of one of the middle houses. A white house with green shutters, one of the bigger ones on the street, with a wide front porch that faced directly onto the road. He was sitting in a wooden chair right at the edge of the porch, leaning forward slightly with his elbows on his knees, and he was looking directly at my car. I noticed him because in 2 years of driving this road, I had never seen a single person outside. And here was a man sitting on his porch in November in 40-degree weather, just staring at the road. I slowed down a little without fully thinking about why. As I got closer, I could see him better. He was older, maybe 60 or 65, with white hair and a heavy dark jacket. His face was completely still. No expression at all. Not the casual glance of someone who heard a car, not the mild curiosity of a neighbor checking who was driving by. Just a flat, direct stare that followed my car as I moved down the street, told myself it was nothing. Old guy sitting on his porch. Completely normal. But then I passed him, and I checked my rearview mirror the way you do automatically. And he had turned in his chair to keep watching me. Fully turned around, facing backward, watching my car move toward the dead end of the street. I turned around in the dead end and headed back out the way I came, which meant I had to drive past his house again. He had turned back around in his chair to face the road, and as I passed him the second time, he did the same thing. Tracked my car with that completely flat expression, then turned around in his chair to watch me go. I drove home and sat in my driveway for a while. I told myself it was a lonely old man who did not get much traffic on his quiet street and was curious about passing cars. That was a perfectly reasonable explanation. I almost believed it, and I did not drive down Dunmore Road for 2 weeks after that. I took the long way around like Diane did, adding the extra 4 minutes back into my commute, and I did not examine the reason too closely. I just did it. Then one evening, I was coming home later than usual, almost 8 at night, and I was tired and not paying attention, and I turned onto Dunmore Road again without meaning to. Muscle memory. I was 3 houses in before I realized what I had done. The street was dark. Most of the houses had lights on inside, but the street lights on Dunmore Road were older and spaced further apart than on the main roads. So there were long stretches of real dark between the pools of yellow light. I slowed down more than I needed to, feeling that uncomfortable chest tightening, feeling that I was starting to associate specifically with this street. Malrin, I was almost to the White House with green shutters when I saw that the porch was empty. No man, no chair, nothing. Just a dark porch. I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. Then I looked at the window next to the front door. He was standing inside, right at the window, in the dark of the house with no light behind him. Just standing there looking out. His face was close enough to the glass that I could see the outline of it clearly as my headlights swept across the front of the house. Same flat expression, same direct stare. I pressed the gas and drove to the end of the street faster than I should have, and turned around and left without looking back at his house again. My hands were tight on the wheel the whole drive home. That night, I called my older brother Danny, but who had grown up in the same town and moved away about 5 years before. I asked him what he knew about Dunmore Road. The line was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Why are you asking about that street?" I told him I drove through it regularly for work and had started noticing some things that were bothering me. He said, "Stop driving through it. I am serious. Use Millbrook Avenue instead. It only adds a few minutes." I asked him what he knew. He said, "When we were kids, you were too young to remember this. A boy from our school named Robbie Cavett went missing. He was 11. They searched for weeks and never found him. His family lived on Dunmore Road." I said I was sorry to hear that, but I did not understand what it had to do with what I was experiencing. Danny was quiet again for a longer moment this time. Then he said, Robbie was not the first one. There was a girl in the 70s. A man in the 80s who just walked out of his house one night and never came back. Always from that street. Always people who lived there or who spent a lot of time there. I asked him if anyone ever figured out why. He said, "Nobody who lives on that street ever talks about it. They just stay inside, and the people from the rest of town just learn to go around it. It is one of those things that everybody in town knows without anybody ever actually saying it out loud." I asked him about the old man in the White House with the green shutters. Danny did not answer for so long that I thought the call had dropped. Then he said very carefully, "Nobody has lived in that house for at least 15 years. The family that owned it moved away a long time ago. It has been empty ever since." I sat in my kitchen holding my phone and looking at nothing. Empty for 15 years. Page 3. What Diane knew. I did not sleep well that night. I kept thinking about that face at the window, the way it had been pressed close to the glass in a completely dark house, looking out with that flat, patient expression. The more I thought about it, the worse it got. Because in the moment I had assumed it was just a strange old man being strange. But an empty house changes the entire shape of what I saw. It does not have an innocent explanation anymore. It just sits there in your memory, getting heavier and heavier the longer you think about it. I went into work the next morning, and I waited until the first slow period of the day, and then I went and stood next to Diane at the register and told her everything. The man on the porch, the window, what Danny had told me about the house being empty. I told her all of it, and I watched her face while I talked. She did not look surprised. That was the thing that hit me hardest. She looked like someone hearing a story they already knew the ending to, nodding slightly in certain places, her expression careful and settled in a way that told me she had been holding this information for a long time and was now deciding how much of it to let go of. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How many times have you driven down that street total, would you say?" I thought about it and said probably close to 400 times over 2 years, give or take. She closed her eyes briefly and said, "That is too many." I asked her what she meant by that. She said, "There is something on that street that pays attention to people who pass through regularly, not people who go down it once or twice by accident. It does not seem to care about those people. But if you use it as a regular route, if you become a pattern on that street, it starts to notice you." I asked her how she knew this. She said that her mother had grown up 2 streets over from Dunmore Road and had told her things when she was young, things that had been passed down from people in town going back several generations. She said the understanding in town, the unspoken one that Danny had described, was that Dunmore Road had always been wrong, even before the houses were built there, even when it was just a dirt path along the base of the mountain. And the people who originally settled that part of town had known to avoid that stretch of ground, and most of them did. But eventually the town grew, and someone built houses there anyway, and then more houses, and eventually it just became a street like any other street, except that it was not. I asked her what exactly was wrong with it. She thought about how to say it for a moment and then said, "My mother called it a hungry place. She said some ground just is that way. It does not matter what you put on top of it, houses or roads or anything else. Underneath it is still the same ground it always was, and it still wants the same things it always wanted." I asked what it wanted. Diane looked at me and said, "People who belong to it. People who come back enough times that it starts to think of them as its own." I felt the skin on my arms go tight. I asked her how you know when that point has been reached. She said, "You start seeing things that should not be there. Things that look like people but are not quite right. Things that watch you in a way that feels like they are measuring something, like they are trying to decide if you are ready." I thought about the man on the porch with his flat expression and his slow, patient tracking of my car. I thought about the face at the window in the dark, empty house. I thought about the way neither of them had moved urgently or acted threatening. They had just watched, calmly, steadily, like something that had all the time in the world, like something that was deciding. I had heard that word before, in a different set of woods, from a 12-year-old boy wrapped in a camp blanket. She is deciding. And here it was again, on a completely different stretch of wrong ground, the same word, the same feeling, underneath it. Diane told me to stop driving down Dunmore Road immediately and permanently. She said to add whatever time it took to go around and to think of those extra minutes as the cost of being left alone. She said the thing about places like that is that they do not chase you. They do not have to. They just keep presenting themselves, keep putting themselves in your path, keep offering you the shortcut, and they wait for you to keep choosing it. She said the choosing is the whole point. Every time you turn onto that street voluntarily, you're telling it something. And after enough times, it starts to believe you. I told her I had already driven down it again after the first time I saw the man, even after I had decided not to. I told her I had gone back out of habit, without thinking. She nodded slowly and said, "That is how it works. It makes itself feel normal. It makes itself feel like just a road, so that your guard comes down and your feet learn the way there and your hands just turn the wheel without asking your brain first." I asked her if she thought it was too late for me. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that I started to feel sick. Then she said, "I think you caught it early enough, but you have to mean it when you stop. You cannot go back down that street even once more, not to prove to yourself that you are fine, not out of habit, not for any reason. Because one more time might be the time that it decides you have come back enough." I told her I understood. She said, "I mean it. I have known 2 people in this town who thought they could just drive down it one last time and be fine. One of them moved away so fast they left furniture in the house. The other one I have not seen in about 3 years. She went back to work after that, and we did not talk about it again for the rest of the shift. The normalcy of scanning groceries and making change felt very thin and fragile that afternoon, like a layer of ice over deep water. And I was very aware of how much ordinary life depends on agreeing not to think too hard about what is underneath it. I took Millbrook Avenue home that evening. It added 6 minutes to my drive. The sky was getting dark, and the mountains were black shapes against a dark blue sky, and everything looked exactly the way it always had. Completely ordinary, completely quiet. At the intersection where I normally would have turned onto Dunmore Road, I kept straight without slowing down. I did not look down the street as I passed the opening of it. I had made a decision, and I intended to keep it. But in my peripheral vision, just for a half second as I passed the intersection, I saw a shape standing at the far end of Dunmore Road, near the dead end where the pavement met the trees, tall and still, facing my direction. I kept driving, and I did not turn my head, and I did not slow down, and I did not look in the rearview mirror. I just kept my eyes straight ahead and my hands steady on the wheel, and I drove home the long way. It's the way I should have been going all along. That night, I sat in my kitchen and wrote down everything I remembered about every time I had driven down that street, trying to put it in order, trying to understand the shape of it. How it had started as just a convenient shortcut. How it had slowly become a habit. How the habit had become something that my body did without consulting my brain. How by the time I noticed what was happening, I had already driven down it close to 400 times, and something at the end of that road already knew my car and knew my schedule and had started standing outside in the cold November air to watch me pass. 400 times of telling it I was coming back. 400 times of choosing the shortcut. 400 times of the ground underneath that cracked pavement listening to my tires and counting. Page 4. The last turn. I kept my word for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of Millbrook Avenue, 3 weeks of the extra 6 minutes, 3 weeks of keeping my eyes straight ahead every time I passed the intersection where Dunmore Road opened up off the main street. It got easier after the first few days. The pull of the habit faded a little. I started to feel like maybe I was going to be okay. Then December came, and with it the kind of cold that settles into eastern Kentucky like it owns the place. The kind of cold that makes your car take longer to warm up and makes every extra minute of driving feel twice as long. The gas station where I worked had a broken heater for most of that month, and I was spending 8-hour shifts in a building that never got above 55 degrees inside. And by the time my shift ended every evening, I was cold all the way through and exhausted, and all I wanted was to be home. I want to be honest about what happened because I think the honesty is the most important part of this story. I did not go back down Dunmore Road because something forced me to. I did not go back because of an emergency, or because Millbrook Avenue was blocked, or because I had any reason that would hold up to scrutiny. I went back because I was cold and tired, and the shortcut was right there. And for just one moment, I let myself think that Diane was probably exaggerating, and that Danny was repeating old small-town superstition, and that I was a grown adult who could drive down whatever street I wanted without anything happening. I turned onto Dunmore Road on a Thursday evening at 7:45. It was fully dark, and the temperature was around 28 degrees, and there was a thin layer of ice on the road that made my tires feel uncertain underneath me. My headlights swept down the empty street, and everything looked exactly the same as it always had. Cracked pavement, overgrown sidewalk grass stiff with frost, old houses with their lights on inside and their curtains drawn. For the first 100 feet, nothing happened, and I felt the tension in my shoulders start to ease, and I thought, see? It is just a street. Then I noticed the street lights. There were 4 of them on Dunmore Road, spaced unevenly down the length of the block. On every other night I had driven through, at least 2 or 3 of them had been on, casting those pale yellow pools of light I mentioned before. But tonight, every single one of them was dark. The only light on the entire street was coming from my own headlights, and it made the road feel like a tunnel, like the darkness on either side was a solid thing pressing in toward the beam. I told myself the cold had knocked out the lights. Perfectly reasonable. Old street lights in an old part of town in freezing temperatures. I kept driving. I was about even with the White House with green shutters when my headlights started to flicker. Not go out completely, just stutter, the way old electronics do when something is interfering with them. The road in front of me went from lit to dark and back to lit in a rhythm that made my eyes hurt and made the shadows between the houses jump and shift in a way that was deeply disorienting. I slowed almost to a stop and gripped the wheel and told myself to just get to the end of the street and turn around and leave and never come back. Then my headlights went out completely. Full dark. The only light anywhere was the faint glow of my dashboard and the distant lights from the main road behind me. Too far back to reach where I was sitting, and I was in the middle of Dunmore Road in complete darkness, and my hands were shaking, and I could not tell if it was from the cold or from fear or from both. I sat there for what felt like a full minute, but was probably about 10 seconds. Then I reached for my phone to use the flashlight and realized I had left it on the counter at the gas station when I clocked out. I had been so tired and cold that I had walked out without it. So I was sitting in a dead car on a dark street with no phone in 28-degree weather. I made the decision to get out and walk back to the main road. It was maybe 150 feet behind me, and there were street lights there and other cars and everything that a main road has that Dunmore Road did not. I told myself to just open the door and walk quickly and not look at the houses and not stop for any reason until I reached the corner. I put my hand on the door handle, and something outside put its hand on the door too. Not an aggressive grab, not a violent shaking of the handle. Just a steady pressure from the outside, the way a person holds a door handle when they are about to open it from the other side. Steady and calm and patient. I went completely rigid. I could not move, could not breathe, could not make a single decision about what to do next. I just sat there with my hand on the inside handle, feeling the pressure on the outside of it. And the whole world narrowed down to that one point of contact between my hand and whatever was on the other side of that door. It held the handle for a long time. Not long enough that my brain ran through every possible rational explanation and discarded all of them. Long enough that I started to understand, on a very deep and animal level, that this was it. This was the thing Diane had warned me about. This was what 400 voluntary trips down this road had been building toward. Then the pressure released. Just like that. Gone. The handle was just a handle again, and the door was just a door, and the dark outside my window was just dark. My headlights came back on. All 4 streetlights on Dunmore Road came back on at the same time, flooding the street with that pale yellow light. And in that sudden light, I could see the full length of the road ahead of me, and the dead end and the wall of trees at the far end. There was nobody outside. No shape, no figure, under no tall, still presence anywhere on the street. Just empty pavement and frost-covered grass and dark houses with lights on inside. I started my car, and I drove to the dead end, and I turned around, which took longer than it should have because my hands would not stop shaking. And I drove back out to the main road at a speed that was probably not safe on an icy road, and I did not care, even slightly. I turned onto Millbrook Avenue and drove home, and sat in my driveway with the engine running and the heat blowing for about 20 minutes before I trusted my legs enough to walk to my front door. I called Diane that night and told her what happened. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Did it open the door?" I said no. The pressure let go, and the door stayed closed. She said, "Then you still have time. But I need you to hear me when I say that there will not be another time. What you felt tonight was it telling you that it knows you, that you belong to it now in some way. The only reason you are sitting in your house right now instead of gone like the others is that it chose to let go of that handle. And I cannot tell you why it did that. I do not know why it would." I asked her what I should do. She said, "Move if you can. Not because it will come looking for you somewhere else. It does not work that way. It is tied to that place. But because you live 4 minutes away from it, and you have already proven to yourself that your hands will turn that wheel without asking your brain first, you are not safe from your own habits." I moved 4 months later. I took a job in Lexington and packed up my apartment and left. I told people it was for the career opportunity, which was true enough that it did not feel like a lie. On my last day in town, I drove to Diane's house to say goodbye. She walked me to my car and hugged me and said to take care of myself. I told her I would. As I was pulling out of her street, I had to pass the main intersection near Dunmore Road, the same one I had passed 100 times in those final weeks, keeping my eyes straight ahead. This time, without meaning to, I looked. The street was empty and still, and the morning light sat flat and gray on the cracked pavement. Every house looked quiet and ordinary. The white house with the green shutters was just a house, its porch empty, its windows dark. But at the very far end of the street, at the dead end where the pavement met the trees, there was a figure standing at the edge of the woods. Too far away to see clearly. Just a shape, tall and thin and completely still, facing the main road. Facing me. I held its gaze for just a second, long enough to feel that familiar flat pressure of being watched and measured and known. Long enough to understand that it had seen me pack my car and knew I was leaving, and had come to the end of its road to watch me go. Then I looked away and drove toward the highway, and did not stop until I was well clear of those mountains. I have been in Lexington for 2 years now. I do not drive down unfamiliar streets more than once if I can help it. I take the long way around when something feels wrong, even if I cannot explain why. I have learned to listen to that animal part of my brain that knows things before the rest of me catches up. And I have never once taken a shortcut just because it was there. Because that is what it taught me, more than anything else. Not that there are dark things in the world. I already knew that. But that dark things are patient, and that patience is a kind of intelligence, and that the most dangerous roads are the ones that feel like the easy way home.